15 years. In 15 years, a person grows up, goes through numerous changes, and learns to see the world differently. Their marriage had lasted just as long, and Jack, reflecting on those years, often compared it to their children. His daughter had just started college, and his son was rapidly approaching the age when life begins to acquire real meaning. Their family had always seemed strong, close-knit, and happy. They were a team. Jack and Susan always considered each other best friends. Arguments happened, but they never escalated into anything serious. Their home was always filled with laughter, support, and mutual faith. Friends, with whom they frequently spent time, only enhanced this idyllic picture. Especially close were Mark and Liza, a married couple whose values seemed to perfectly align with their own. Every visit turned into a cozy evening. A bit of alcohol, board games, conversations about life, and memories that painted the past as bright and carefree. Typically, Liza and Jack would retire to bed earlier, leaving Susan and Mark to enjoy their late-night talks. It had become a tradition, one taken for granted. That night began no differently. After a few glasses of wine and hearty laughter, Liza, sipping her drink, said she was tired and headed upstairs. Jack nodded and followed her, feeling pleasantly drowsy. As he lay in bed, his thoughts drifted, perhaps to a conversation about the trip they were planning with the kids, or simply to the peace of a long day coming to an end. But sleep wouldn't come. There was something strange about that night, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He tossed and turned in bed, trying to understand what was bothering him. Then, without any apparent reason, he got up and headed downstairs. That's when he heard it. Soft voices, muffled laughter, and sounds that pierced his mind like sharp needles. They were coming from the basement. It was odd. No one usually went down there. With each step, his heart began to pound harder. When he reached the door and opened it, his world shattered. Susan and Mark, their bodies intertwined, their faces alight with a passion Jack had always thought belonged to just the two of them. For a split second, he froze, unable to believe his eyes. Time seemed to stop, but soon, that paralysis gave way to rage. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice came out as a low roar, filled with pain and anger. Susan flinched, turning her head toward him, her eyes filled with fear and regret. Mark, frozen in place, looked paralyzed. Jack stepped forward, and for a moment, Mark thought he might kill him. "Get out of my house," Jack hissed, barely managing to contain his fury, mindful of his son sleeping upstairs. He turned and headed to Liza's bedroom. She had to know. She had to hear it from him. When he entered the room, Liza seemed to be dozing. "Liza, wake up." She opened her eyes, blinking in surprise at the tension on his face. "What's going on?" "I don't know how to say this," he said, sitting down beside her with a heavy sigh. "But I need you to stay as quiet as possible. Our kids are sleeping." Her expression grew alarmed, but she didn't interrupt. Jack gathered all his strength to continue. "Your husband and my wife. They were together in the basement." For several seconds, silence filled the room. Liza, not immediately grasping the meaning of his words, remained still. Then her face contorted in pain. She opened her mouth but couldn't find the words. Jack wrapped his arms around her, though he himself felt utterly hollow. "We need them to leave," he whispered. "Can you take him home?" Liza nodded. She stood, as if in a daze, and went downstairs. A few minutes later, they were gone. Jack was left alone in the darkness, staring at the door through which his wife had just disappeared. His world had collapsed, and he had no idea how to rebuild it. Jack sat on the edge of his bed, his mind racing with fragments of memories, emotions, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. The silence of the house was deafening. Upstairs, his son slept soundly, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had unfolded beneath his roof. Jack couldn't shake the image from his mind. His wife, his partner of 15 years, with another man. Not just any man, but someone he had called a friend. It was an image that burned into his thoughts, tearing through him like shrapnel. The following morning, the house felt cold despite the sunlight streaming through the windows. Jack sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched coffee. He could hear the faint sound of movement upstairs, his son getting ready for school. He had to keep it together, at least for now. When Sienna finally came down, her face was pale and blotchy from hours of crying. She looked like she had aged 10 years overnight. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something. Remorse, guilt, or perhaps desperation. Jack didn't know, and frankly, he didn't care. "Jack," she began, her voice trembling, "please, can we talk?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood, poured his coffee down the sink, and leaned against the counter. He could feel her eyes on him, pleading silently. "You have 5 minutes," he said coldly, his voice devoid of the warmth it once held for her. Sienna flinched but nodded. She stepped closer, her hands trembling as she clutched the back of a chair for support. "I made a mistake. A horrible, terrible mistake. I don't even know what I was thinking." "Stop," Jack interrupted, his voice sharp. "Once? Maybe I'd believe it was a mistake. But twice? That's not a mistake, Sienna. That's a choice. A deliberate, premeditated choice. So don't insult me by pretending it's anything else." Tears welled up in her eyes again, spilling over as she sank into the chair. I don't even know how it happened. We were talking, and it just happened." Jack let out a bitter laugh. "It just happened? That's your excuse? You've been lying to me, to our kids, to everyone. For what? For some cheap thrill?" Her sobs grew louder, and she buried her face in her hands. Jack didn't feel any pity. Not now. Maybe not ever. "I want a divorce," he said firmly. Sienna's head shot up, her eyes wide and filled with panic. "No. Jack, please, don't do this. Don't throw away everything we've built, everything we have. I love you. You're my entire world. Please, don't leave me." Her words felt hollow, like echoes in an empty room. He shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Your world? Really? Because it didn't seem like I was your world when you were with him." "I was stupid," she pleaded. "I was stupid and selfish, and I hate myself for it. Please, Jack. Please, we can fix this." Jack clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Not just to me, but to our kids? To our family? Our daughter just started college and our son. Our son was home when this happened. He was asleep upstairs while you—" His voice broke, and he turned away, unable to finish the sentence. "I'll do anything," she said, standing and moving toward him. "Anything you need me to do. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just don't end this. Don't throw us away." Jack felt the walls closing in. Her words were desperate, but they couldn't erase what had happened. He turned to face her, his expression hard. "I didn't throw us away. You did." Sienna froze, her face crumpling as the weight of his words settled over her. Jack didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. Jack walked into the living room and sank into the couch, his head in his hands. The weight of everything pressed down on him like a suffocating fog. He had no idea what to do next. Divorce felt inevitable, but the thought of breaking his family apart twisted his stomach. He knew his daughter, Emma, would be devastated, and his son, Ethan, would never look at his mother the same way again. They didn't deserve this. "Dad?" Jack looked up to see Ethan standing at the foot of the stairs. His son was still in his pajamas, his hair sticking up at odd angles. He looked concerned, his sharp eyes scanning Jack's face. "Hey, buddy," Jack said, forcing a weak smile. "You're up early." Ethan hesitated, then sat down across from his father. "I heard yelling last night. Is everything okay?" Jack's heart sank. He had tried so hard to keep his voice down, to keep Ethan from hearing anything. But of course, a 15-year-old wasn't going to sleep through that kind of tension. He exhaled deeply. "Your mom and I had a disagreement," he said carefully. "It's complicated, but I want you to know that no matter what happens, I love you and your sister more than anything. That will never change." Ethan frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Is she okay? You seemed really mad." Jack hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. He wanted to shield Ethan from the truth, but he also didn't want to lie. "We're going through something really tough right now, Ethan, but you don't need to worry about it, okay?" Just focus on school and being a kid. Ethan studied his father for a moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, he said, though his tone suggested he didn't fully believe it. Jack reached over and ruffled Ethan's hair. Go get dressed. I'll make us some breakfast. Ethan nodded again and headed upstairs. Jack leaned back into the couch, his head spinning. How was he supposed to protect his kids from something so ugly? He felt a pang of guilt, knowing that no matter how hard he tried, their lives were already irreversibly changed. Later that day, Jack sat in his car outside Emma's college dorm. He had texted her earlier, asking if they could talk. She'd agreed, though her reply had been short and wary. He couldn't blame her. Dropping by unannounced wasn't his usual style, and she was likely wondering what was so important. When she finally emerged, her face lit up in a smile, though it quickly faded as she noticed his strained expression. Dad? Is everything okay? She asked, climbing into the passenger seat. Jack hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Emma, there's something I need to tell you. It's not easy, and it's going to hurt, but I think you deserve to know. Her brow furrowed, and she crossed her arms. You're scaring me, Dad. What's going on? He took a deep breath. Your mom and we're having some serious problems right now, and I think we're going to get a divorce. Her eyes widened in shock. What? No. Why? What happened? Jack struggled to find the right words. She made a mistake, a big one, something I can't forgive. I'm so sorry, Emma. I know this isn't what you want to hear. Emma's face contorted with anger and confusion. A mistake? What kind of mistake? Jack hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She was unfaithful, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma stared at him, her mouth slightly open. Are you serious? Mom? With who? Jack looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Someone we know. It doesn't matter who. Emma sat back, her hands trembling. This doesn't make sense. Mom and Mark? Or was it someone else? Her voice cracked as she tried to process the information. It was Mark, Jack said quietly. I found out last night. Emma shook her head in disbelief. This can't be real. They've known each other forever. How could she do this to you? To us? Jack reached for her hand, but she pulled away. Tears streamed down her face as she stared out the window. What's going to happen now? I don't know, Jack admitted. I just know I can't stay in this marriage. But I promise you, Emma, I'll do everything I can to make sure you and Ethan are okay. She didn't respond. For the first time, Jack felt the full weight of what had been lost. Not just his marriage, but the sense of safety and stability his family had once had. Emma's silence spoke volumes, and it crushed him. That night, Jack lay awake in the guest room, the same room he'd moved into after the confrontation. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt oppressive. His thoughts churned, replaying the events of the past few days like a nightmare he couldn't escape. Sienna had tried to talk to him again, but he'd shut her down. Her apologies felt like empty words now. She'd begged him to consider counseling, to at least try to save what was left of their marriage. But every time he thought about forgiving her, the image of her and Mark would flash through his mind, and he knew he couldn't do it. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He reached for it, surprised to see a message from Liza. Liza, I don't know if it helps, but I'm here if you need to talk. This hurts for me too. Jack stared at the message for a long time. Liza had every right to be angry, just as much as he did. Yet her words carried a quiet strength, a reminder that they weren't alone in this mess. He considered replying but decided against it. There would be time for that later. For now, he needed to focus on what mattered most. His kids and figuring out how to rebuild his life from the rubble. The days that followed felt like wading through quicksand. Every step was heavy, every breath labored. Jack threw himself into routine, hoping it would distract him. He focused on his kids, on ensuring that their lives weren't completely upended, even though he knew it was an impossible task. Ethan had started asking more questions, his quiet observance turning into careful probing. Jack gave him simple, honest answers, careful not to burden him with too much detail. Emma, however, was a different story. She called him late one night, her voice tense with unresolved anger. "Dad," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I need to understand something." Jack sat up in bed, already knowing where this was headed. "What is it? Have you really thought about this? I mean, is divorce the only option? Maybe Mom made a mistake, but doesn't everyone deserve a second chance?" Her words were quick, but they carried a sharp edge. He took a deep breath. "Emma, I know this is hard to accept, but this wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. A conscious, repeated choice. Trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight, and without trust, there's no marriage." Emma's silence stretched across the line before she spoke again. "So that's it? You're just done with her? With us as a family?" "I'm not done with you or Ethan," Jack said firmly. "You two are my priority. But I can't pretend everything is fine when it's not. Staying together for appearances wouldn't be fair to anyone." Her voice cracked. "I just don't want to lose our family." Jack's chest tightened. "You're not losing it. It's just changing. I know it doesn't feel that way right now, but I promise we'll get through this." When the call ended, Jack felt a deep ache in his chest. He hated that his decision was hurting his kids, even though he believed it was the right thing to do. He couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter what he did, it would never be enough. A week later, Jack finally agreed to meet with Sienna. She had been relentless, sending him texts and leaving him voicemails, begging for a chance to talk. He chose a neutral location, a small park a few blocks away, where the openness of the setting felt less suffocating. Sienna arrived first, sitting on a bench with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked drained, her once bright eyes now clouded with exhaustion. When Jack approached, she stood, her movements hesitant, like she wasn't sure whether she was allowed to. "Thank you for meeting me," she said softly. Jack nodded but didn't sit. "What do you want, Sienna?" Her face crumpled, but she quickly composed herself. "I wanted to apologize. Again. I know you don't want to hear it, but I need to say it. I'm so sorry for what I did to you, to us. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how much I regret it." Jack folded his arms, keeping his face neutral. "You've already said that. What's the point of this?" "I want to fight for us," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to prove to you that I can be better, that this doesn't have to be the end." Jack shook his head. "How do you expect me to believe that? You didn't just betray me once. You did it twice. You lied to my face, to our kids. How am I supposed to trust you again?" "I don't know," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. Therapy, counseling, anything. I can't lose you, Jack." Her desperation was palpable, but it only deepened his anger. "You already lost me the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you." Sienna flinched, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his words. Jack wanted to feel satisfaction, but all he felt was an empty ache. "I'm filing for divorce," he said finally. "I've already spoken to a lawyer." Her eyes widened in shock. "Jack, please." "It's over, Sienna," he said firmly. "I'll work with you to make this as smooth as possible for the kids, but that's it. I can't be your husband anymore." Sienna collapsed onto the bench, sobbing into her hands. Jack stood there for a moment, his resolve wavering. But then he turned and walked away, leaving her behind. Over the next few weeks, Jack took steps to start over. He moved out of the house into a small rental nearby, wanting to stay close to Ethan and Emma. The divorce process was painful, but he focused on being present for his kids. He encouraged Ethan to talk openly about his feelings and checked in with Emma regularly, even if their conversations were still strained. One afternoon, Jack received another message from Liza. They hadn't spoken since her initial text, but her words stayed with him. "This hurts for me too." "This time," he replied, "how are you holding up?" Liza responded almost immediately. "Surviving. You?" "Same." Their exchange was brief but comforting. In some strange way, knowing someone else understood his pain made it a little more bearable. Over time, their messages became more frequent. They didn't talk about their exes or what had happened, but about life, their kids, and the small victories that kept them going. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jack's life was far from perfect, but it was moving forward. He learned to embrace the small moments, watching Ethan's soccer games, hearing Emma laugh during their calls, feeling the sun on his face during morning runs. The scars of betrayal would always be there, but they no longer defined him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. And that was enough to keep going.